Most people misunderstand what an empath really is. They assume an empath is simply someone who cries easily, forgives endlessly, or struggles to stand up for themselves. They mistake kindness for fragility and compassion for weakness. But that misunderstanding has destroyed more relationships than most people realize. An empath's greatest strength is not emotion, it is awareness. While most people enter a room and notice what is being said, an empath notices what is not being said. They recognize the hesitation before someone answers a question. They notice the forced smile that hides disappointment. They hear the confidence in someone's voice suddenly disappear when a certain topic comes up. Their attention naturally gravitates toward emotional patterns that others overlook. Completely. This isn't magic, and it isn't some supernatural gift. It is the result of an unusually developed sensitivity to human behavior. An empath constantly collects emotional information, often without even realizing it. Their mind is always observing. Their nervous system is always listening. Long before logic reaches a conclusion, their intuition has already begun connecting invisible dots. The problem is that people rarely appreciate this ability while they are benefiting from it. Instead, they begin to expect it. The empath becomes the person everyone calls during a crisis. They become the one who remembers birthdays, notices emotional shifts, checks in after difficult conversations, and offers support even when no one asks. Slowly, they become the emotional foundation for everyone around them. And because they make it look effortless, people assume it costs them nothing. But every act of understanding requires energy. Every time an empath absorbs another person's frustration, anxiety, grief, or insecurity, something inside them is being spent. Emotional energy may be invisible, but it is not unlimited. Just as the strongest muscles eventually fatigue under constant strain, even the strongest heart grows tired when it carries burdens that were never its responsibility. This is where the greatest misunderstanding begins. Many people believe patience has no limits, because they have never seen those limits. An empath rarely reacts immediately. They usually choose understanding before judgment. They ask questions instead of making accusations. They offer another chance before walking away. They search for explanations instead of assigning blame. To someone who lacks emotional awareness, this patience can look like weakness. They think, if they haven't left yet, they'll never leave. If they forgave me once, they'll forgive me again. If they keep understanding me, I don't have to change. This is one of the most dangerous assumptions a person can make, because what looks like endless tolerance is often silent observation. An empath is paying attention to every broken promise, every forgotten apology, every moment where words and actions fail to match. They are not ignoring the behavior. They are simply giving the other person time to become who they claimed they wanted to be. That distinction matters. Compassion does not erase memory. Forgiveness does not eliminate pattern recognition. Kindness does not disable intelligence. An empath can love someone deeply while simultaneously recognizing that the relationship is becoming unhealthy. And here's where psychology offers an important insight. Human beings naturally adapt to consistency. If someone continues receiving love, despite selfish behavior, the brain slowly begins treating that love as guaranteed, rather than earned. Gratitude fades. Appreciation weakens. Entitlement quietly replaces respect. Without realizing it, people begin taking extraordinary kindness as something ordinary. The empath notices this long before anyone else does. Not because they are searching for flaws, but because emotional imbalance becomes impossible for them to ignore forever. Imagine carrying a glass of water with your arm extended. For the first minute, it feels effortless. 10 minutes later, your arm begins to ache. After an hour, even though the glass hasn't become heavier, the weight feels unbearable. Relationships work the same way. The problem isn't always one major betrayal. Often, it's hundreds of tiny disappointments accumulating over months or years. One dismissed feeling, one broken promise, one selfish decision, one unnecessary lie, one conversation where they felt unseen. Individually, each moment appears insignificant. Collectively, they become impossible to carry. And through it all, the empath often remains calm, not because nothing hurts, because they value peace more than proving a point. That calmness is frequently mistaken for emotional dependence, when, in reality, It reflects extraordinary emotional discipline. Anyone can react. Few people can consistently choose restraint. That restraint should never be confused with an inability to leave. Because beneath every compassionate heart exists something far stronger than emotion. There is self-respect. It may stay quiet for months, sometimes years, but eventually, it begins asking difficult questions. Why am I the only one trying? Why is my kindness expected, but never returned? Why am I carrying a relationship that requires two people? Those questions change everything. Once an empath begins asking them honestly, the entire relationship starts shifting beneath the surface. Nothing dramatic happens overnight. There are no loud announcements, no emotional explosions, only quiet observation, quiet reflection, quiet preparation. Most people never notice this transformation while it is happening. They only notice when the empath they thought would stay forever is suddenly gone. By then, the decision wasn't impulsive. It was the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding silently for a very long time. The strongest people are rarely the loudest. They are often the ones whose kindness has been mistaken for weakness, until the day they decide they will never accept less than the respect they have always given. An empath experiences betrayal differently than most people. It's not simply because they are more emotional, it's because they invest more of themselves into every relationship they value. They don't offer attention casually. They don't pretend to care. When they commit to someone, whether it's a friend, a partner, or a family member, they do it completely. That depth is beautiful, but it also comes with a cost. Every broken promise carries more weight, because trust was never given lightly. Every lie feels larger, because honesty was assumed to be mutual. Every act of indifference strikes deeper, because the empath cannot imagine intentionally making someone they love feel invisible. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Human beings don't measure pain by the event itself. We measure it by the meaning attached to it. The same action can have completely different emotional consequences depending on who performs it and what expectations already exist. When a stranger disappoints you, you may shrug and move on. When someone you deeply trusted does the exact same thing, the emotional impact multiplies. For an empath, relationships are built on emotional consistency. They pay attention to details. They remember conversations. They remember how people felt during difficult moments. They often sacrifice comfort to preserve harmony. Because of that investment, every betrayal feels less like a single mistake and more like evidence that the relationship may not be as genuine as they believed. Yet here's what makes empaths different. They rarely give up after the first wound. Instead, they search for understanding. Maybe that person is stressed. Maybe they're struggling with something they haven't shared. Maybe they didn't mean what they said. Maybe they'll change. Those 4 words, maybe they'll change, have kept countless empaths in unhealthy relationships far longer than they should have stayed. Hope is one of the most admirable qualities a person can possess. But hope without boundaries slowly becomes self-neglect. The empath convinces themselves that compassion requires endurance, that unconditional love means accepting behavior that continuously damages their peace, that patience is proof of loyalty. It isn't. Real loyalty never requires abandoning yourself. There is an important psychological principle at work here. People often repeat behaviors that carry no meaningful consequences. If disrespect is consistently followed by forgiveness without accountability, the brain quietly learns that the behavior is acceptable, not because the person consciously wants to hurt anyone, because human beings naturally adapt to whatever becomes normal. The empath unintentionally teaches people how to treat them by accepting treatment they would never offer in return, and this creates an exhausting internal conflict. On one side is their heart, reminding them of every good memory, every shared laugh, every glimpse of the person they know someone could become. On the other side is reality, showing them repeated patterns that cannot be ignored forever. This tension is emotionally draining because empaths don't simply process events. They process intentions. They ask themselves questions that other people rarely consider. What pain caused them to act this way? What are they afraid of? Can I help them become better? These questions come from extraordinary compassion, But there is a hidden danger. When you spend too much time explaining someone else's behavior, you stop evaluating its effect on your own life. Eventually, the empath begins carrying emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They apologize to keep the peace when they weren't at fault. They overthink conversations that the other person has already forgotten. They lose sleep trying to solve problems someone else refuses to acknowledge. This isn't love anymore. It's emotional overextension. Philosophically, there is an important distinction between empathy and self-sacrifice. Empathy allows you to understand another person's suffering. Self-sacrifice convinces you that their suffering matters more than your own. Healthy relationships require empathy from both sides. Unhealthy relationships survive because only one person continues providing it. That realization doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly. The empath notices they are the one initiating every difficult conversation, the one repairing every misunderstanding, the one offering every apology, the one making every compromise. At first, these seem like isolated moments. Eventually, they reveal a pattern. Patterns are difficult to argue with, because they tell the truth that individual moments, often, hide. One forgotten promise can be excused. 20 forgotten promises become a character trait. One careless comment can be forgiven. Years of careless comments reshape how someone feels about themselves. This is why emotional scars become invisible. No single event appears devastating enough to justify walking away, but together, they gradually erode trust, confidence, and emotional safety. The empath keeps hoping for the version of the relationship that existed in their heart, rather than the one unfolding in reality. That hope is noble, but wisdom eventually asks a different question. Not, can this person change? Instead, have they chosen to? There is a profound difference. Potential is not the same as commitment. Promises are not the same as action. Intentions are not the same as consistent behavior. When an empath finally accepts those distinctions, something begins shifting beneath the surface. They stop chasing possibilities and start paying attention to reality. That quiet shift marks the beginning of a transformation that few people recognize until it is already complete. Never ignore the small betrayals simply because they seem insignificant. A heart is rarely broken by one moment. It is broken by the quiet accumulation of moments that should never have happened in the first place. There comes a point in every empath's journey when they realize that understanding someone is not the same as being safe with them. This realization is one of the most emotionally difficult lessons a compassionate person can learn, because it forces them to separate two ideas they have always kept together. They can understand why someone behaves a certain way. They can even feel sympathy for the pain that shaped them. But neither of those things obligates them to remain where they are consistently being hurt. That distinction changes everything. For a long time, the empath believed that if they could simply communicate more clearly, love more deeply, or become more patient, the relationship would improve. They searched for the perfect words. They replayed conversations in their mind. They wondered if they had misunderstood something, or failed to express themselves well enough. This is what emotionally intelligent people often do. Before blaming others, they first question themselves. That humility is admirable, but taken too far, it becomes dangerous. When every conflict begins with self-examination and ends with self-blame, a person slowly loses sight of objective reality. They begin carrying responsibility for problems they did not create. They start believing that if they just become a little more understanding, a little more forgiving, or a little less demanding, everything will finally stabilize. It never does, because relationships are not repaired by one person's effort. They are repaired by mutual responsibility. The empath eventually notices a painful pattern. Every meaningful conversation follows the same cycle. They explain how they feel. The other person apologizes. Promises are made. Things improve for a short while. Then everything quietly returns to exactly the way it was before. Psychologists often refer to this as intermittent reinforcement. Small moments of improvement create hope, and hope encourages people to stay longer than they otherwise would. Those temporary changes feel so significant that they overshadow the much larger pattern surrounding them. The empath clings to those moments because they genuinely believe transformation is possible. And transformation is possible, but only when both people are committed to it. One person's sincerity can never substitute for another person's willingness. Eventually, reality becomes impossible to negotiate with. The empath notices that they are no longer explaining themselves because they expect to be understood. They are explaining themselves because they are hoping to be valued. Those are two completely different motivations. The first builds connection. The second reveals desperation. Once that realization settles in, something remarkable begins to happen. The empath speaks less. Not because they have stopped caring, because they have started observing. Instead of arguing, they watch behavior. Instead of believing promises, they pay attention to consistency. Instead of asking for respect repeatedly, they notice whether respect appears naturally. Silence becomes information. Behavior becomes evidence. Patterns become impossible to ignore. To someone standing on the outside, this change can seem cold or distant. People often ask, "Why have you changed?" But the empath knows something important. They haven't changed overnight. They have simply stopped pretending that the situation is healthier than it really is. There is a philosophical principle worth considering here. Truth does not become false because it is uncomfortable, and denial does not become wisdom because it lasts a long time. For months, sometimes years, the empath has been negotiating with reality. They have tried to believe intentions over actions. They have trusted words over patterns. They have protected someone else's comfort at the expense of their own peace. Now they begin doing something different. They accept what is. Acceptance is often misunderstood. People assume acceptance means approval. It doesn't. Acceptance simply means seeing reality without trying to rewrite it. This person is showing me who they are. These behaviors are recurring. This relationship cannot become healthy through hope alone. Those thoughts are painful, but they are liberating. Because once reality is accepted, decisions become clearer. The empath no longer feels compelled to convince anyone of their worth. They stop chasing conversations that lead nowhere. They stop defending feelings that have already been dismissed 100 times. They stop trying to rescue people who refuse to rescue themselves. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. Internally, it feels like peace returning. One of the greatest signs of emotional maturity is recognizing the difference between connection and attachment. Connection is built on mutual respect. Attachment often survives on fear. The empath slowly releases that fear. The fear of disappointing people. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of walking away from history. The fear of starting over. As those fears lose their influence, something stronger takes their place. Self-respect. And self-respect rarely announces itself with anger. It reveals itself through boundaries. Healthy boundaries are not punishments. They are statements of self-worth. They quietly say, "I can care about you without abandoning myself." That sentence has the power to transform an entire life. Here's the irony that many people never recognize until it is too late. The empath's silence is often mistaken for surrender. In reality, it is preparation. By the time they stop arguing, they have already spent countless nights thinking, questioning, grieving, and hoping. Their emotional decision was made long before anyone noticed the behavioral one. When they finally stop explaining, it is not because they have run out of words. It is because they have finally accepted that words cannot change someone who has chosen not to. Listen. Never underestimate the quiet moments in a relationship. The loudest warning is not an argument. It is the day a compassionate person decides that their peace is worth more than another unanswered explanation. One of the greatest misconceptions about empaths is that they are incapable of leaving because they forgive so many times, because they fight so hard for the people they love. Others begin believing that their presence is permanent. Familiarity creates an illusion of certainty. The more consistently someone stays, the easier it becomes to assume they always will. But permanence is not a personality trait. It is a decision, and every decision has a limit. What most people fail to understand is that an empath rarely leaves during the moment of greatest conflict. In fact, by the time they physically walk away, they have often spent months, or even years, processing the emotional reality of that decision. While everyone else believes the relationship is continuing as usual, the empath has already begun mourning what it once was. This is why their departure often feels sudden to everyone except them. For the empath, it is not sudden at all. It is the final step in a journey that began with the first broken promise, continued through every ignored conversation, and reached its conclusion the moment hope could no longer outweigh reality. Psychologists describe grief as something that doesn't belong exclusively to loss after separation. Human beings often grieve while they are still present. We mourn expectations that will never be fulfilled. We mourn versions of people that never truly existed. We mourn futures we imagined but will never experience. Empaths know this form of grief intimately. Long before they leave a relationship, they grieve inside it. Every disappointment slowly replaces an expectation. Every repeated pattern reshapes a belief. Every act of emotional neglect quietly dismantles the future they once envisioned. By the time they finally step away, they are not escaping the pain. They have already lived through most of it. Ironically, that is when the other person often begins feeling what the empath has carried for months or years. At first, there is confusion. Why have they become so distant? Why aren't they responding the way they used to? Why don't they seem interested in fixing things anymore? Those questions emerge because people often notice the absence of something only after they have stopped receiving it. Kindness is easiest to overlook while it is consistently available. Its value becomes unmistakable only after it disappears. Think about the emotional habits people develop in relationships. Someone remembers every important date. Someone notices when you're unusually quiet. Someone asks how you're doing and genuinely waits to hear the answer. Someone celebrates your victories as though they were their own. Someone quietly absorbs your frustrations without keeping score. When these actions happen every day, they become invisible. The human brain adapts remarkably quickly to consistency. What once felt extraordinary slowly becomes expected. Gratitude quietly gives way to assumption. Assumption eventually becomes entitlement. Then one day, those acts of care stop. Not out of cruelty, but because the person offering them finally realizes they have been giving from an empty cup. That is when the emotional vacuum becomes impossible to ignore. People often mistake an empath's kindness as something easily replaceable. They believe another relationship will provide the same emotional safety. Another friend will listen the same way. Another partner will understand them without explanation. Another person will continue offering unconditional patience. Sometimes they discover too late that genuine emotional presence is one of the rarest qualities a human being can possess. Not everyone pays attention the way an empath does. Not everyone remembers what matters to you. Not everyone chooses compassion when resentment would be easier. These qualities cannot be replicated simply because they were never fully appreciated. Philosophically, this reflects a timeless truth. People rarely recognize the value of what has become ordinary. Only distance restores perspective. Only absence reveals significance. Only silence exposes everything that words failed to communicate. Meanwhile, something extraordinary is happening inside the empath. Without the constant pressure of managing someone else's emotional instability, they begin reconnecting with themselves. Their mind becomes quieter. Their nervous system begins relaxing. They laugh without forcing it. They sleep more peacefully. They stop questioning their own worth every time someone else behaves carelessly. Little by little, they remember who they were before they became responsible for everyone else's emotional world. Healing doesn't happen because the past suddenly disappears. Healing happens because the empath stops feeding energy into what continues to wound them. That energy returns home. It becomes confidence. It becomes creativity. It becomes emotional clarity. Most importantly, it becomes freedom. Freedom is one of the least understood psychological experiences. Many people think freedom means doing whatever they want. True freedom is much quieter. It means no longer needing validation from people who repeatedly refuse to understand your value. It means waking up without carrying emotional burdens that never belong to you. It means discovering that peace is not found by changing other people. It is found by changing what you continue allowing into your life. This is why the consequences of breaking an empath often arrive long after the relationship ends. The empath grows stronger. The person who took them for granted is left confronting an uncomfortable realization. The care they assumed would always be there was never guaranteed. It was a gift. And gifts lose nothing of their value simply because someone failed to recognize them in time. If there is one lesson worth remembering, it is this. Never become so comfortable with someone's kindness that you forget it is a choice. The greatest losses in life are rarely caused by the people who stop loving. They are caused by the people who realized they had been loving alone for far too long. When an empath reaches the end of their emotional endurance, something unexpected happens. They stop trying to change other people. They stop trying to be understood by those who have repeatedly chosen not to understand them. They stop investing energy into relationships that require endless sacrifice but offer little emotional safety in return. From the outside, it may appear as though they have become colder. In reality, they have become clearer. There is a significant psychological difference between emotional shutdown and emotional detachment. Emotional shutdown is driven by fear. A person closes themselves off because they are overwhelmed, exhausted, or unable to process their pain. Healthy detachment is something entirely different. It is the ability to care without allowing another person's choices to dictate your inner peace. It is not the absence of compassion. It is compassion guided by wisdom. For years, the empath believed that loving harder could repair what was broken. They believed more patience would eventually inspire more respect. They believed one more conversation might finally create the breakthrough they had been hoping for. Eventually, experience teaches a lesson that hope alone never could. People change when they decide to change. Not because someone loves them enough. Not because someone explains themselves more clearly. Not because someone sacrifices more of themselves. Real transformation always begins with personal responsibility. That realization is painful because it forces the empath to release one of the most comforting illusions imaginable. The belief that they can save everyone they care about. But it is also incredibly liberating. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with stones. At first, you barely notice the weight because you've grown accustomed to it. You convince yourself that carrying it is simply part of who you are. Then one day, someone asks a simple question. What if those stones were never yours to carry? That question changes everything. The empath begins examining every emotional burden they have accepted over the years. Someone else's anger, someone else's insecurity, someone else's inability to communicate honestly, someone else's unwillingness to heal. Piece by piece, they set those burdens down, not because they no longer care, because they finally understand the difference between supporting someone and becoming responsible for their life. This distinction is one of the foundations of emotional maturity. You can love someone deeply without rescuing them. You can forgive someone without trusting them again. You can wish someone well without inviting them back into your life. These truths are uncomfortable because they challenge a popular misconception that love should always endure, regardless of circumstances. But philosophy has reminded us, for centuries, that virtue without wisdom becomes self-destruction. Compassion without boundaries becomes exploitation. Generosity without discernment becomes depletion. Patience without accountability becomes permission. The empath finally understands that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Something remarkable happens once that understanding takes root. The emotional energy once spent managing conflict becomes available for growth. They invest in their health. They rebuild neglected friendships. They pursue forgotten dreams. They discover interests they abandoned while trying to keep everyone else happy. Perhaps for the first time in years, they ask a simple question. What kind of life do I want to create? Notice the difference. The focus has shifted from changing another person to developing themselves. That is where real power begins. Many people mistake this transformation for indifference. It isn't. The empath has not lost the ability to love. They have simply become more selective about where that love is invested. Their heart remains open. Their boundaries become stronger. Those two qualities are not opposites. They are partners. Psychologically, this represents one of the healthiest stages of personal development. Secure individuals do not avoid relationships because they fear being hurt, nor do they remain in harmful relationships because they fear being alone. They choose relationships based on mutual respect, emotional consistency, and shared responsibility. The empath eventually reaches this place, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because pain has taught them discernment. There is another consequence that many people overlook. The person who underestimated the empath often expects another opportunity. They believe enough time will erase everything. They assume an apology can restore what years of neglect slowly destroyed. Sometimes reconciliation is possible, but only when genuine accountability replaces empty promises. Trust is rebuilt through consistent behavior, not emotional speeches. And once an empath has fully detached, they rarely return to the version of themselves that accepted less than they deserved. The greatest consequence, then, is not punishment. It is permanence. The opportunity that was repeatedly taken for granted quietly disappears. Not because the empath wanted revenge,